This week I thought I'd talk about making an instant garden, and what I mean by that is creating a veggie patch with minimal effort and minimal costs, ideally none. And then once it's created, maintaining that garden in such a way that it's just easy to keep on top of. And to do that, we'll need to talk about compost and mulch. So if I wanted to, say, expand my veggie patch and run something down here, I'm going to have to deal with the grass. So whenever you're starting a new veggie patch, you're always going to have to deal with grass or weeds. And one way to do it is to dig it all out. But for me, that's just way too much effort, and I don't actually think it's worth it. The best thing I think to do by far is to put cardboard down. Once you put cardboard down, it will suppress the grass and the weeds, and it will give a chance for your plants to establish. In terms of getting cardboard, I'd probably get it from a bike shop. That's where you can get the largest kind of chunks of cardboard. You just need to cut the staples out of them and lay them down. I'd lay them down and make the rows about 120, so about 3 foot wide, something like that, with some space either side for pathways. And then I would just put compost on top of it. I mean, there's really two ways of doing this. One is just to lay compost down, or if you don't have compost, you could use the lasagne method. So when I made these gardens, I used the no-dig method. So I laid down cardboard and then just put compost on top. And when you first start out, you need loads of compost. So this is about 10 to 15 centimetres deep, 4 to 6 inches. So that's a lot. Like all up, you're looking at sort of 5 to 6 cubic metres. And obviously nobody has that much compost lying around, so you end up having to buy it. Obviously buying that much compost from a garden centre would be ridiculously expensive, so you have to get it from somewhere like a landscape supply place, or the local council often sell it for much cheaper. The local council get that waste from, you know, green waste, vegetable scraps, hedge trimmings, all that sort of stuff. They collect it up in many areas and then either give it away or they sell it pretty cheaply. You can of course make your own, but that's a lot of compost to make, and if you're just getting started, it's pretty tricky. So the second method of creating an instant garden is by laying cardboard down, and instead of putting compost onto it, you're just layering greens and browns, which is just what you would do with a normal kind of mulch on top of the garden. And the way the plants are then going to grow is that you stab a hole into the cardboard and put your seedlings into the ground, so they're rooting into the soil. And the mulch is just kind of, well, in the first instance, it's just holding the cardboard in place so it doesn't blow away. But over time, it will kind of rot down into compost. And then the next year, you'll just plant directly into that compost. The reason it's called the lasagne method is because you are layering greens and browns as your mulch, one on top of the other. And the reason for doing that is that without it, the kind of decomposition process isn't going to work very well. So if you were to only use greens, let's say grass clippings, if you just loaded this area up with grass clippings, often you're not really going to get enough air into that grass. When you've got kind of woody material like you know, from your browns, it means that you've got something fibrous there, and that means oxygen gets in, and that allows the whole thing to compost. Without it, you get this kind of anaerobic composting whereby things can get a bit sort of moldy, a bit smelly, and a bit sort of hot. It's just not a great method. So you want to have that mixture of greens and browns loaded up on top of each other. This is what was a massive pile of wood chip. I had it delivered 2 years ago. And I've used most of it on the fruit trees, and what's left, I've been using bits of it on the garden. The problem with wood chip, if you used it on its own, is it takes a really long time to break down. So like I said, this has been here 2 years, and if you just look at the size of these pieces, they're quite big and they're not readily going to break down. But I've been taking the stuff that's been sitting around for a couple of years right on the bottom, where, you know, this is a different matter. It's already started to kind of break down. It's sort of a bit softer, smaller pieces, and that mixed in with the green together is going to do a good job of composting. If you were to just use that on its own, just like using the grass on its own, that's not going to work well either. The problem with carbon material like this is that when it breaks down, it actually uses nitrogen, and you need nitrogen for your plants, so it's kind of taking away something that your plants needs. That's okay if it's mixed in with a strong nitrogen source like, say, grass clippings, and the two things will compost nicely together. But yeah, it's something that you need to kind of layer one on top of the other, or just generally mix around. In terms of which of those two methods is better, it's sort of dependent on your soil type. So for me, I don't think the soil here is very good. It's clay. There hasn't been lots of organic matter falling onto this part of the ground. It was just used as a lawn for years. So there's probably not much nutrition in it really. For me, composting worked best because that meant for my first year I could just plant food straight into it and get pretty decent results. If the soil type you've got is already quite good, then the lasagna method might work for you because you're using the nutrients that are already in the soil. And to be honest, even if it doesn't work that well, it's only your first year, so you could just have so-so crops growing in the ground. But for the next year, all of that stuff you've been putting down in your lasagna of mulch is then going to create compost. So when you go to the next year, you're going to get a much better result. The great thing about either of these methods is that these gardens are really easy to maintain. You hardly ever need to weed, and that's because you're adding compost and mulch, which smothers the weeds. So what I'm doing here is I've added wood chip along the pathway, and that means almost nothing grows through that. And then where the plants are, I'm using, in this case, I'm using a sort of a bit of grass and a bit of wood chip, and that is creating a mulch which blocks weeds, stops them coming through, and it also rots down to give you compost for the next year. I also add about an inch of compost each year in the winter on top of the beds, and that's really easy to do. I no longer need to buy it because creating just an inch worth of compost is not a very big deal, especially with a garden of this size. So I just, anything that once it's dead or no longer useful in the garden and I weed it out, I pull all this stuff out, put it on the compost along with all the kind of grass trimmings. All of that lot breaks down and I can create my own compost, which I then just put on top of the garden. And just that is enough to keep things, that keeps the weeds suppressed, and it also gives masses of nutrients for the plants to grow. So this is where the magic happens. A bit geeky, I know, but I like composting almost as much as I like gardening. It's good fun. I mean, ideally you're doing the same thing as you are with the lasagna method, i.e. that you are layering greens and browns. That will give you the best composting results. I don't always do that. I quite often just stuff it in, and whatever I've got in the garden, that's what goes in. So typically I'll have more greens than I do browns. But browns you can get from stuff like, cardboard goes in here. That would be a brown. Anything like this that's tends to be a bit more fibrous, they're typically brown. That looks like some broccoli or something like that, or kale. See this stuff, this should be a bit smaller really to help it compost, but that is, yeah, that's woody, so that would act quite nicely as a brown and help everything break down. This is the finished product. I've got a couple of bins here either side, and when each one fills up, I then turn it over into the middle bin, so these two bins will effectively compress into one. And let's dig up some of this. Like, this is, in my opinion, very good. I mean, that just looks like normal soil. There's probably a few little woody bits in just because they take a little bit longer to break down, but that's going to go really well on the garden. And just having these three bins, so each one is obviously just these are 1 metre each, so you've got a metre cube. Just that is enough to keep the garden going, and each year I can put that on. And then there's like no reason at all to fertilise or to worry about the soil type that you've got. It just takes all that worry away. You know that what you're putting on here is enough for the plants to get all the nutrients that they need. Just to recap on that stuff, if you're starting a garden from scratch, there are two methods as I see it. You've either got the no-dig method where you put cardboard down to suppress the weeds, you load compost on top of that, and then you plant directly into the compost. That's method number one. Method number two is that you just lay cardboard down and then you mulch on top of it with a mixture of green and brown, so you're layering those on top of each other, and then when you plant, you're actually stabbing a hole through the cardboard into the soil beneath, and you're planting into that soil. Those are the two methods. What's similar about them both is that when you think about it, that layering method, that lasagna method, you're really putting nitrogen and carbon on top of each other, which is exactly what happens when you're composting anyway. So when you think about it, the lasagna method is really just, I guess, an impatient method of the no-dig method. You're just trying to get your compost instantly, if you like. And then once your garden is established, you're then either applying new compost or you're applying new mulch, and whichever you're doing, it's still the same thing. You're still layering greens one on top of the other, cardboard and then grass or wood chip and then leaf matter or whatever it is. And in terms of green materials are typically sort of leafy green things, like they could be flowers, they could be anything that you take from the garden here, anything like vegetable peelings, anything like that. And then browns are typically more fibrous, woody kinds of material. So they could be the stalky, stemmy kind of bits off plants, they could be shrubs, they could be cardboard that's been ripped up, stuff like straw, hay, anything that is much more kind of fibrous. That's what's going to get the kind of air into the compost. That's what's going to allow that kind of decomposition process to take place. So I would advocate using that kind of layering technique on everything. So even if you're adding a bit of mulch, I would just still layer it. Like this time of year, it's really hot. The ground gets dry amazingly quickly. And so even if you've got lots of compost down, it's still constantly in danger of drying out. So quite aside from the nutritional benefit, it's worth having some mulch down. And then if you can layer it, it just means that at the end of the season, one, it will have retained the moisture, but two, it will have kind of decomposed down and you'll already have a layer of compost ready to go for the next season. Let me know what you're doing. Are you gardening in that kind of old-fashioned way when you dig, or are you using either of those two methods? Let me know what you're up to. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week.